It's the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilpert, coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. War, earthquakes, refugees, poverty. We often think that all of these things are bad for business. However, according to the book Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe by Antony Loewenstein, corporations and companies are finding ways to make more and more money out of disasters. Not only that, they manage to perpetuate the conditions of disaster in order to profit ever more from them. Joining us today from Jerusalem is the book's author, Antony Loewenstein. Antony is an independent Australian journalist, documentary maker, and blogger who has written for the BBC, The Nation, and The Washington Post. He's also a Weekly Guardian columnist and the author of several best-selling books. So good to have you with us today, Antony.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
So two of your blurbs on your book, the one by Naomi Klein and by Jeremy Scahill, essentially say that your book continues where Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, leaves off. And actually, you make this argument more or less in the introduction of your book as well. Explain to us briefly what the central argument of the shock doctrine was and how your book continues Naomi Klein's analysis.
So when Naomi's book came out in 2007, what I liked about it, and along I also should say with books like Blackwater by Jeremy Scahill, amongst others, also Iraq Inc., which talked about the privatization of Iraq after the 2003 Iraq War, all those kind of books. What I liked about them was that it gave almost a global economic model for what was happening. In other words, in your introduction, you explained very correctly that some people would say, well, clearly, a refugee crisis could not be good for business. In other words, it's going to be bad for human rights, bad for society, bad for a country, but in fact, it's actually wonderful for business. Corporations can make money from detention or other areas like that. So Naomi's book had a very global perspective, and what I liked about it was there was room for expanding that thesis. And one of the big differences between my book and hers, apart from the fact that we focus on different countries around the world, is my major focus on immigration and refugees. And the refugee issue wasn't as much of an issue in 2007, although of course it was still an issue. And now in the second decade of the 21st century, refugees is arguably one of the great issues. So I looked at countries like Australia, the US, UK, Greece, countries that have really gone through a great deal of suffering in the last years, and refugees themselves who have been treated pretty badly in all those countries. And the connection between them all is that often the same corporations are involved, the same corporations running the detention centres, the same corporations often managing the food, healthcare. And I thought it was important for people to see the global connections between these issues.
So, and one of the key aspects of your argument, at least what I can glean from it, is that that neoliberalism, which aims to privatize everything, to turn everything over to market forces, is behind disaster capitalism as an ideology. Is this correct? Would you say that that's correct? And tell us a little bit more about this connection between neoliberalism and, if it's correct, what's the connection between neoliberalism and disaster capitalism?
Definitely. So neoliberalism essentially, as you rightly say, is this idea somehow that the role of the state should be minimal or non-existent. And what's so fascinating and disturbing about that is that in virtually every country where people are polled or asked questions about what they think about these policies, they're fundamentally unpopular. So when you ask Americans, Australians, those in Britain, much of Europe, in fact, much of the world, people don't like the idea that their water could be privatized or public services or various other elements, because they've seen often up close or in other countries how disastrous that's been for service providing. So the connection between disaster capitalism and neoliberalism is that you have really in many, certainly Western countries, almost a bipartisan consensus that somehow outsourcing is the solution, that somehow privatizing detention, privatizing immigration, privatizing war is the right thing to do. People, I think, often make the mistake, especially in the US, for example, when Donald Trump is now president, that things will get far worse than it was during Obama. On many issues, I would agree with that. However, when the Bush administration after 9/11 accelerated the privatization of war, Obama continued that with a very, very disturbing continuity. In other words, the privatization of contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan did not stop during Obama. The outsourcing of intelligence continued under Obama. In fact, many elements of the post-9/11 environment that Bush began, Obama has deepened, and Trump will no doubt accelerate even more. There is a continuity here. And what's so disturbing to me and sad is that many of the activists who are now in the US particularly outraged, rightly, about the disgusting policies of Donald Trump, whether it's immigration or war or whatever it may be, were often largely silent, not all, but many during the Obama years, the 8 years of Obama, because somehow they believed mistakenly that he could be more trusted. But in fact, the reality is, when it comes to, say, immigration, outsourcing, and war, Obama, in fact, accelerated and deepened the policies of the previous president, George W. Bush. So neoliberalism and disaster capitalism are connected, and they have bipartisan support in most and many countries.
And how do you explain that even though these policies are so unpopular, populations keep electing people like that promote these kinds of policies?
It's a really good question, and the short answer is there is no short answer. But the slightly longer answer is that I think often in many countries, and in Western countries at least, there's not really much of a choice. And I'm not suggesting, for example, that Donald Trump was the same as Hillary Clinton. There were deep similarities, but also major differences. But at the same time, the key issues around immigration or outsourcing of immigration is not generally seen as a popular issue. In other words, when, for example, in America, you have growing numbers of immigrants who are dying in privatized immigration facilities during Bush, during Obama, during Trump, that's generally not seen, sadly, as a so-called sexy issue. It's not really a vote winner or vote loser. Certainly, maybe Hispanic communities will vote along those issues, but many communities will not. And I think often there's been a lot of studies in the last couple of decades about why people often vote for parties that in fact are against their economic interests. I just read some study last week that a lot of Trump supporters in the US, some of whom may have buyer's remorse a few months after he was elected already, are often voting for a person like Donald Trump because they see in this particular election in 2016 a belief somehow that there was disillusionment with Obama, or disillusionment with this idea somehow that they were, as white men and women, disadvantaged in American society, that somehow blacks or minorities or LGBTI or other individuals are somehow getting benefits that they as white people are not. But often they're voting for parties like the Republican Party that in fact will be against their economic interests. So I think what is needed, desperately needed in many countries, US, Australia, the UK, and much of the world, is not this obsession with a two-party consensus. A two-party consensus in general does not help the majority of the population. And the problem is that most people are not given any reliable alternative to vote for when it comes to the election, which I think is a real problem for democracy.
Your book actually spans the entire globe, from Pakistan and Afghanistan to Papua New Guinea, Greece, Haiti, US, Britain, Australia. We don't have time to cover all of these, but let's take a closer look at one or two of them. And I'd like to pick Papua New Guinea, mainly because most people are quite unfamiliar with that country. Just tell us a little bit about what you found there and how disaster capitalism works there, just briefly.
So Papua New Guinea is a country to the north of Australia. It is one of the most beautiful countries in the world and also one of the richest. When I say richest, I mean in terms of natural resources. Many of the global largest mining companies, American and British companies, are operating copper or gold mines in Papua New Guinea. It was an Australian colony until 1975. And since then, in the last 40 or so years, it's become one of the poorest, most devastated countries in that region. I focus on an area called Bougainville, which was the site of one of Asia Pacific's most violent civil wars in the 1980s. And this was over a Rio Tinto mine, a copper mine, that was incredibly destructive, environmentally devastating, and left the community there in very, very bad shape. And the reason I wanted to mention Papua New Guinea, as you rightly say, most people have never heard of the country, but also to give an example of a nation like Papua New Guinea, and we say PNG for short, which is deeply rich, but in fact incredibly poor. In other words, the resource curse, which is a term that I did not invent, of course, which I look at in other countries too, is very, very relevant here. So when you have a major multinational, Rio Tinto, operating in Papua New Guinea for decades, you really have a situation where the company itself is making a fortune. They leave after a civil war. Up to 20,000 individuals were killed in that civil war. And here we are a few decades on after the end of the civil war. And I've spent quite a lot of time in Bougainville in the last 5 years. And you still find a beautiful area, very lush, very green. but incredibly poor. There's no infrastructure. There is now talk of reopening that dirty mine that was never cleaned up in the first place. And I think the lesson really here is that when we look to our political leaders for some kind of direction, and people often look to those people, and I would argue that they're not going to find much salvation there, what you find in a place like Bougainville is a very rare example of locals rising up and actually winning against a multinational. We should also not forget that Australia, the Papua New Guinea government and others were on side with the Bougainville mining organisation. The locals were on one side and the rest of the world was on the other side. The locals won, but at an incredibly high price. And a film I'm also working on at the moment called Disaster Capitalism, which I hope will be finished this year in 2017, also features Bougainville and really shows how local resistance, both then and now, actually can imagine an alternative. Agriculture, tourism, mining is not the only solution or answer to a poor territory's problems. And unfortunately, many of the powers that be in Papua New Guinea today, and indeed further afield, are arguing that mining must come back. But in fact, that's not the case at all.
Well, this is all the time we have for part one of this interview. We'll pick it up again in part two. We're speaking with Antony Loewenstein, the author of the book Disaster Capitalism. So tune in for part two.